Well, hello. Um, this is the seminar series of the International Inequalities Institute. My name is Facundo Alvaredo. Today we are welcoming Franziska Disslbacher, and she will present. She is an assistant professor from the University of Vienna, and she's presenting Living Legacies and Liabilities, the distribution of wealth at death. And as you know, usually you prefer questions we usually ask questions at the end of the presentation. We can interrupt. And there's also the questions online. I don't know if anybody is connected. Well, I give the floor to.
So this paper looks at a very specific distribution of wealth, namely the distribution of wealth among the population dying in a given year. And as with, but it worked earlier, right?
Probably just have to click the screen, just click once on the mouse.
On the mouse?
Yeah.
Okay, I take the mouse. So as with the distribution of wealth among the living population, so what we tend to be usually debating when we're talking about wealth inequality, the distribution of wealth among the dead is driven by a range of factors. For instance, individual characteristics, we know that there are wealth gaps by socioeconomic characteristics and across socioeconomic groups such as gender or race or ethnicity. The distribution of wealth at death also is shaped by what people consume along their life cycle, because it is really what is left when they die. So sort of net of life cycle consumption and savings patterns. And it is also shaped by institutions. So for instance, the inheritance law, inheritance taxation will shape to what extent people sort of save or accumulate or disaccumulate wealth as they are approaching death. It also is related to what we call bequest motives. So for instance, there is a lot of research arguing or being interested in to what extent people enjoy giving wealth to the next generation. So now, nope, not. So even though the distribution of wealth at death is really a specific distribution, it is super relevant to a broad range of debates related to wealth inequality. The first one is in relation to the impact of intergenerational transmission of wealth in the form of inheritances and gifts on the distribution of wealth among the living. Here, I would say that there is kind of a consensus that in the short run, inheritances are equalizing, versus in the long or medium run, they are disequalizing, as people with differential levels of inheritances use these inheritances differentially. So sort of as time goes on, inheritances have a disequalizing effect. The second one is a methodological debate. So one important way to be able to measure the distribution of wealth among the living comes from so-called mortality multiplier estimates, where the deceased population is treated as a random sample of the living population, and then their assets left at death are inflated such to get an approximation of the distribution of wealth, again, in the living population. And this method relies on assumptions on the relationship between mortality rates and age and wealth. And these age-wealth relationships usually are not observed in the data that are used by these methods. So the typically proxies for wealth, such as gender, are used, but we can directly speak about the age-wealth relationship with our work here. Second, of course, it is super relevant for a lot of policy evaluations, policy debates around, again, inheritance taxation mainly. And there is this long-standing debate, especially in the economics literature, to what extent wealth inequality today is driven by life cycle effects. So the population being composed by or of different people who are at different stages of their life cycle accumulation and saving patterns, or rather intergenerational wealth. So we sort of, with looking at this very specific distribution of the wealth held by the deceased population of the year, can also inform a lot of several broader debates around wealth inequality. Essentially, we're asking two questions. First of all, we're trying to understand how this distribution looks like and how it differs from wealth inequality among the living population. And the second question is in relation to the determinants and drivers of the distribution of wealth held at death, where we look at individual characteristics, but also preferences of people, like bequest motives and institutional factors. So this project overall is based on a novel data set that we digitized and that we sort of hand collected, because so in a lot of countries you have data on wealth inequality coming from wealth taxation, but less and less countries directly tax wealth, so there are less data sources of this type available. Another common approach is to use, as I've said, distributions on the wealth of the death population, typically coming from estate tax data. But estate and inheritance taxes usually only tax the top of the distribution, or if it's a large share, you would have data on roughly 50–60% of the population, but typically you don't observe the entire population in these data sources. We identified a data set where we have wealth at death information for that entire population, irrespective of the wealth level they are holding. And this data comes from so-called probate proceedings. So in Austria, there is a law that states whenever a person dies, a district court has to open a probate proceeding. And the goal of this proceeding is first to ensure that the division of the estate is in line with the inheritance law, because only 50% or sort of 50% of the estates are left to compulsory shares that have to go to the spouse and the children, and only the remaining 50% can be divided according to the will of the deceased person. And the other, and this process kind of ensures that the division of the estate is in line with these laws. There is no inheritance taxation, so this is really working irrespective from taxation. The second purpose of this process is the transfer of the legal entitlements of the wealth and asset components, part of the estates, sort of that they are also legally transferred. This means that the legal entitlements to these assets have to be changed in relevant registers, such as the business register, the land register, and so on and so forth. So even though there is no inheritance taxation, this process results in relatively detailed data on the distribution of wealth at death, or the wealth people hold at death. And the entire probate proceeding works as follows. A person dies, and depending on where the person has the usual location of residence at death, the relevant district court assigns the case, so the deceased, to a notary office who acts in charge of the district court. And this notary office has a super important role, because the office compiles a first balance sheet of the assets and the liabilities of the deceased person. So what does this mean? He would check the assets on bank accounts, whether there are any sort of financial account or financial assets on the name of the deceased person, whether the deceased person is with his or her name in any business register or land register or whatsoever, whether there are like substantial outstanding debts. And the notary compiles this first balance sheet with all the assets and all the liabilities. And then there are two options. The first one is to determination of the process without further hearing or a full probate proceeding. And this termination without a hearing can happen in three cases. First of all, the net estate is less than 4,000 euros. Second, the estate is like super over indebted, or the estate is like sort of bankrupt, which mainly happens when it's over indebted, but there are like liabilities, like anything related to companies. Then this would be a proper bankruptcy or insolvency process rather than over indebted estate. In general, for our purpose at the moment, it doesn't really matter whether there is this express process or the full process, because irrespective of the cases, one case file, one death always consists of all the liabilities and all the assets the deceased person holds, even though in differential or in different forms. In the full probate proceeding, by contrast, heirs have an important role because they can choose, they have three options. So a legally entitled heir can either refuse to accept the inheritance. This happens more often than you would assume in about 15% of the cases. And then they can choose between conditional acceptance and unconditional acceptance. And the conditional acceptance is kind of, I would say, an insurance against inheriting debts. So if a heir is not sure whether there is a lot of debt associated with the inheritance, then they can conditionally accept the inheritance, where they would only be sort of they would only take over the assets, but not the liabilities. So it's kind of an insurance. And then there is this unconditional acceptance, which is the inheritance of both assets and liabilities. The important difference to these shorter processes is that in these three cases, the notary officers by law have to compile the balance sheets with all associated valuations of assets and so on. In the termination without a hearing, we were the ones who were compiling the balance sheets, because these case files would mainly consist of a bulk of documents like bills and so on and so forth. And then the process ends with the legal division of the estate. So we are working with a sample for referring to the city of Vienna at the moment. And overall, we have like 13% of all deaths from the years 2014 to 2019 in our data set. And we collected and digitized this data in 2 ways. So, but one thing before I move on with the data set. So this is like super sensitive data, because a case file would also consist the last will and like super personal communications. So we got a special document from the Ministry of Law that rules kind of that research on this data is of public interest. So we were allowed to look at this data, but only in the district court offices. So this is not data that is somewhere available. We really had to go to these district offices and digitize and look at the data or the case files ourselves. This is why we were also working with the sample, because it's not like something that you could access or download from somewhere. And the second important point is that no one had looked or used this data before, at least not from the more recent period. So we first did a case study sample, because we had absolutely no idea whether this could be useful or not. So we had first a case study sample of 300 cases from one Viennese district. And this was a pure random sample. And we used this kind of case study sample to develop our digitization processes and to understand what actually we can see within these data sets or these case files. And then we have what we call our core sample. And here we sampled 10 out of 22 Viennese districts. And we did so because it was really tricky. So we had to convince the district courts to cooperate with us, because these case files are usually in their cellars. And we had to convince somebody to bring the cases to the rooms where we were then allowed to look at them. So we really were a bit restricted in terms of how many district courts we can sample from. But overall, we have 10 out of 22, and they are really mapping on average very nicely to the wealth distribution on population composition and so on, in terms of characteristics of the overall city. And this is like 14% of all the cases from these years. Importantly, we did in our core sample not sample at random, but we have an oversampling strategy where we substituted 5% of the random sample with the cases that had the most procedural steps. And this works as an oversampling of assumed to be wealthy or high net estate cases, because a procedural step would be, for instance, a communication between the district court and lawyers, or between the heirs and lawyers, or the heirs and the district courts. And this is typically something in relation to disputes around the estates associated with the level of estate. Yes, yes, yes.
There is no inheritance tax.
No, zero. I mean, okay, I'll come back to this at the end. So during the work on this project, we discovered that there is something like an inheritance tax, but it's not called inheritance tax, because in the end, once the process is finished, the heirs have to pay 0.05% of the net estate to the court for sort of doing this entire process. But it's like a fee, and not an.
This fee applies to the whole state or to each? Well, it's one fee, right? It's only the same rate.
Yes, yes.
And paid by the state or by the inheritance?
By the heir. Yeah.
With all that, it's not enough to recover the information. Do you use the?
So no, because the only thing we can talk later, but in this fee data, the only thing that we have is the fee paid, and the information on, for instance, real assets and their composition. It's way less details, because it's really just the bill, sort of the amount that we observe. But the advantage of this, bills or the fees is that the data goes back to 1990, and that this is what we're working on now, because we can link it to other micro data. Yeah. Okay. So no inheritance tax, but this sort of probate process that results in this distribution of wealth data. So a lot of other countries have similar processes in place, like the UK or Germany, but typically this again would only apply to estates above a certain threshold. The advantage here is that we really have everyone. So everyone dying in Austria is potentially in these case files. I've already said that. So we hand collected, or we hand digitized these case files. And to give you a better idea what a case file or a death would look like in our data. So this could be a pile of documents, like a couple of pages with bills and so on and so forth. It could be hundreds of pages. For instance, if there are a lot of expert evaluations on the value of real estate, for instance. And we had cases where one case was basically a shopping cart full of documents, because if you have like high wealth estates, you tend to have like several real estate valuations as part of the case, a lot of bank statements on the composition of financial assets and so on. So our definition of wealth at death resembles pretty much a typical definition of net wealth, as you would also find it in, for instance, harmonized survey data. So on the liability side, we have overdrafts and bank accounts, outstanding credit card debt, outstanding mortgages, but also non-mortgage debt. And we also include here death-related expenses, such as funeral expenses, and importantly, unpaid expenses for old age care. So whenever a person resides in a public old age care home until 2017, the government sort of had in place kind of an asset recovery where when the person died and had left some assets, they would sort of take back the money for the unpaid expenses out of the estates. But this was in place only until 2017. On the real asset side, we have real assets, businesses, cars, valuables, but also cash. In terms of financial assets, any types of savings on banks accounts, stocks and shares and bonds held by the deceased person. So the important thing in terms of this balance sheet is that for most of the items, we have the market value directly coming out of the case file, because in terms of overdrafts on bank accounts, it would be the number on the bank account. In terms of outstanding credit card debt, it would be the number on the bill. In terms of financial assets, it would be whatever sort of the bank statement would tell us. The one complicated thing here is real estate, so houses and land, because they are valued by law in terms of unit values rather than market values. Unit values have been set in the 80s and then never really adjusted, so they are super undervalued and super outdated. And what we did is to use the subsample of real estates where we had both the market value coming from an expert valuation and the administrative value coming from the case files. And then we estimated the relationship between those values and kind of imputed back the market value for the real estates where we only had the administrative values based on this correlation. Other than that, we took the valuations as they were in the case files. So, this is the distribution of wealth at death, as we observe it for the city of Vienna in these 5 years, 2014 to 2019. And a typical population that you would observe in estate data is like this upper tail of the distribution, because they are once paying estate taxes, but we really have like from indebted, highly indebted estates to highly positive estates. We can cover the full range of estates. And what we see is that about 50% of the population die with 0 net wealth, whereas about 20% of the population die indebted. And these debts can be substantial. So here we have like in the lowest percentile, the average amount of debt is like around 500,000 euros. And then in the second percentile, it's already at close to 200,000 euros. And then we have like the huge share of zero estates, and starting at the 80th percentile, estates become substantially positive. So at the 80th percentile, we have a value of 114,000 euros. In the top percentile, we have an average of 6 million, but this is really just an average. So if we would look at smaller groups, which we are not allowed to do, we would see a very high concentration within this top.
Among the highly indebted ones, is it because in the ones with very high debt, they can have people who actually have a lot of capital and allow them to take it out?
I'll get to this point.
And just a small question, this is pulling people across all ages, right? So you have
Yes.
people that died at 40 for some reason, and sorry.
So this is really just, if you look at like very naive distribution across all years arranged by the network. So first of all, zooming in at, at this group of the top group, the top 20%, dying with substantial positive net estates or assets. Amongst those, the most important asset component is real estate, followed by funds, so any type of financial assets. Then the blue ones are life insurances and cars, and this is other assets such as valuables. And as compared to other data, sort of on estate, tax data, or also survey data, what stands a bit out here is that this other asset component is relatively large in this group here, because my impression is that sort of valuable, important pieces of art are captured relatively better in this type of probate data as compared to inheritance data. If we then zoom in to the liabilities side, this is by deciles of the wealth distribution, the shares, the relative distribution of liability categories within the deciles. So the dark green one, let me start with this one. These are funeral expenses, which we sort of count as a liability because it's not transferred to the next generation. It's paid off out of the estate. Usually, this is outstanding mortgage debt. And the yellow one are again these long-term care liabilities, which are relatively important at the bottom of the distribution. And these are all sorts of, the light greenish are all sorts of other liabilities, such as bank account overdrafts, credit card debt, and so on. And again, keep in mind, it's just these two deciles who have like substantially positive overall net estates. Here we would have the net zero, and this is the net negative part, which is really driven by all sorts of outstanding unpaid bills and these long-term care expenses.
Sorry to understand. The second and third percentile, we had like 100, 200,000-ish, right? So if I read this correctly, then they still paid 50,000 euros or so for their funeral?
So this is funeral, and this would be net.
Yeah,
So
the other one, the third one.
This is about, no, wait, these were the deciles. You had the percentile. We are here like at
Oh, decile, sorry, okay, I thought it was percentile, yeah. My bad.
it would be 2,000 or 3,000. Yeah. Then we had the question to what extent the negative estates are negative because there are a lot of debts and a lot of assets at the same time. Part of the estate, again, these are deciles, but what we see is that there are some assets among those with a highly indebted estates, but it's really driven by the liabilities component, and again, among the liabilities, the long-term care liabilities and other liabilities. So these other liabilities would really be a mix of all types of unpaid debt or all types of unpaid bills, like for phones, for pharmacies, and also at the bottom, so in the top decile, that we have like some substantial liabilities, but here it's by contrast really driven by mortgage debts against these real estate.
My question is kind of, I'm surprised a bit about this kind of smaller share of financial wealth relative to real estate, not for the top 10%, but kind of for but it doesn't change across the top 20%, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to increase substantially. And I was wondering whether it's it's something related to the unique.
It's a Vienna effect.
Exactly, a unique Viennese thing that real estate is really unusual.
Yes.
Okay.
I can't say, so we can look at a couple of things. But yeah, it's a Vienna effect because you would have like a homeownership rate of around 20%, which is like substantially lower than in the rest of the country and in other European cities. And these 20% of homeowners would be sort of, I guess, relatively even spread among those top percentiles. Yeah. But I have an idea. Because actually we know whether people lived in public housing or in terms of inequality measures, some very, again, raw measures, we find Gini coefficients, including all the cases, so including the negatives of above 1. Again, this is because of the big share of the population dying with negative net wealth. If we exclude the negative ones, we find Ginis of about 0.9, which is roughly the same as for the overall city. So in that sense, in terms of inequality measures, if we exclude the negatives, the distribution of these of the probate cases is very similar in terms of inequality measures to the distribution of wealth among the living. Next, we look. Question. Next, we look at the distribution of inheritances. So for each of the cases, we know the number of heirs and how the estate has been divided among the heirs and so on. So the first important thing that we need to know is the number of heirs by cases. So on average, there are like about 2 heirs by case, where we have some cases with a lot of heirs, like more than 7, and a substantial number with just 1 heir. So this is important because the sort of how the distribution of the estates then links to the distribution of inheritances is a function of the number of heirs and how they vary across the distribution. So we have a bit more than 2 heirs by case on average, and a bit larger number of heirs in the top decile of the distribution, and lower than average number of heirs, so about 1.8 in the bottom 50%. Again, this is the part where we have substantially positive estates. Here it's mainly the zeros, and these are the negatives. So the result of this variation is the impact on the distribution of wealth is like really minor. So we have a top decile share of about 90% in the distribution of the estates. Here, this changes by 0.02. So it really has, we don't find a significant or substantial difference between inequality in the estate distribution and inequality among the in the distribution among the heirs, because many people inherit 0, some inherit negatives, and overall we have a sort of relatively equal number of heirs, especially there where there are substantial positive estates. So the difference is statistically irrelevant, so to speak. Next, we look at the already mentioned question, to what extent this distribution is driven by people dying at different ages. So whether those dying with negative wealth are those who are in their young ages and just started to take up a loan and thus are indebted, and those at the top of the wealth at death distribution are those who are just retired and thus had a long working life where they accumulated wealth. And to begin with, we look at this relationship from 2 different perspectives. First of all, the raw relationship between age and the mean probate wealth, so the mean levels across the age distribution. And we can see that up to age 80, probate wealth is increasing, and then it starts to decrease. Importantly, here, people retire about, on average, at a bit less than 60 years. So people accumulate well in their retirement, okay? So, yeah. And then only when they are like 80, probably already seeing death approaching, they start to decumulate. Looking at it from the perspective, so kind of inverting this, the composition of different parts of the estate distribution into age group, we don't find a statistically like substantially a strong pattern. The only thing is that at the very bottom and at the very top of the distribution, the super old ones are slightly overrepresented. So overall, from this, it's not that we would see like this kind of pattern of here having only in the bottom of the distribution, having only the young ones, and at the top of the distribution, having a concentration of the oldest one. This is also underscored by this view at the distribution where we plot among the top 10 and the top 1% of the distribution, again, the relationship between the ages and the mean probate wealth. And again, within these small groups, we don't find strong relationships between the age and the wealth that people have. So overall, we don't find any strong life cycle effects here.
Did you also look at the composition of wealth by age? Because it may be that, for example, when you were looking at the previous slide, when you have this kind of graph for the age, when you have the peak at 80, it may also be that because you're looking at a short time span, right? So it might be that it was cheaper for people at the age of 8, like that are 80 now, to buy a house back then when they were 20, 25, compared to the 60, 40, 50, blah, blah, blah. So it's more like maybe they were able to accumulate more wealth during the young years, whereas younger people cannot, rather than they keep accumulating wealth after retirement, for example.
Yeah, we have like just 5. It's an interesting question. I never looked at this. We never looked at this. And I think it's tricky with this data at the moment. Because I mean, we have you know, sort of in terms of if we would look at it rather from the perspective of cohorts, I would really have to see how many observations we have by cohort age here. I'm not sure whether this is feasible if we then want to break down by asset component in a meaningful way, but it's a very good point. Thank you. One last thing before I have to conclude. We then look at to what extent whether people leave zero wealth or positive estates is related to 3 different measures or indicators of bequest motives that we have developed or that we sort of defined in this data set. The first is a dummy variable for whether the case file included a testament. So leaving a testament it's not compulsory in Austria, but one can do so. The second one is an indicator for life insurances that are kind of dedicated to the name of one specific person or a specific relative. And the third and last one is an indicator for whether substantial gifts given already and are recorded in the case files. Looking at the level of the net estate, we find substantially higher levels of net estate for all three indicators. And then we did a kind of a riff regression where we looked at to what extent this varies across the distribution. And interestingly, we see that at the bottom share of the distribution is by contrast to the top, by the marginal sort of indicator, or by the marginal case having a testament or life into gifts increases, whereas at the top it is kind of equalizing. And overall, combining these two, we find that bequest motives kind of act as equalizing on the distribution of wealth. I have to skip this, but we can talk about it later, because in 2070, this long-term care asset recovery program was abolished, and we looked at the abolishment of this policy and how it impacted the distribution. And just kind of as a brief summary of what we are doing here, the dotted line is before the abandonment, and this is after the abandonment. So this is up to 2017, this is post 2017. And what we see that among those at the oldest ages, when the policy, the asset recovery policy was no longer in place, the mean wealth levels were higher, and the same holds true if we then exclude this recovery, which kind of logically follows from the abandonment of the policy. So using this data, we really can look at the distribution of wealth from bottom to top in terms of estates. And I think this is important because typically what we observe is the bottom 20, bottom 30, bottom 40%, but not the overall distribution. And with this overall distribution, we can speak to a number of debates and learn quite a few interesting things, such as the composition of debts, or to what extent there is a relationship between wealth and age, which is super informative for other methods that rely on assumptions on the age-wealth relationship, essentially. And overall, I would summarize our finding as follows, which is that first, people accumulate well into old age. So even after legal retirement or the actual retirement age, people on average continue to accumulate wealth. And we see that age in our data is a better predictor of average wealth than of wealth inequality, which kind of speaks a bit against this entire distribution driven by primarily life cycle motives or life cycle patterns. Bequest motives, so in our data, again, reduce wealth inequality at death. I've showed you the Gini indexes and how they reduce top shares, whereas they increase bottom shares. And these care costs have what we call we see kind of we call it a dispersion effect, which is the mechanical effect that these asset recovery policy worked only when people really had asset left. So the abolishment of the policy had an impact on a very specific part of the overall estate distribution. At the moment, we're trying to find a way to test for bequest motives a bit more formally, because we're really just using these three dummy indicators where we think that they could approximate bequest motives. And we're kind of revising the entire paper and the entire story. So I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments.
If you have questions, so let's start.
Okay, so thank you very much. Very Awesome data collection and analysis, super important. I was just wondering on a thing, it's maybe related to the bequest things on, especially the fact that you don't see the same increasing like tendency of age correlation and wealth inside the like top percentiles. And I was wondering if it maybe comes with a thing of like fiscal optimization of when like the richest people under 60, they're like, and I think it would also like be related to the fact that you don't see that inside these higher deciles, you don't see a lot of financial like holdings because maybe they just like exit their wealth and they put it in companies, you know, so then it's not going to be in the wealth inheritance anymore if they just pass it on to companies. So maybe if you could like find a way to pick that in your data and document it, I think it really gives an additional source of robustness to your story.
Yeah, so companies, so overall I have to say, the asset composition we have here in the data matches other data on the asset compositions coming from cross-sectional data, but using the same age compositions like very well, except for especially one type of assets, which is business assets. Because of course there is also a lot of literature, especially in sociology, showing how wealth is transmitted to the next generation, especially in the form of business assets, sort of in the name of the families. And this is why business assets are gifted away way earlier, usually than other asset types. We have some, so the problem is that the coverage of these gifting of business assets long pre-death, it's super random in this data. So yeah, but yeah, it's a good point, and it's certainly a limitation that we should at least discuss somehow.
I would add onto that this idea that we accumulate, will accumulate over age, totally it's ideological. All the evidence we have is that at the top of the distribution, there is no relationship between wealth and age. Perhaps in high growth situations, China 20 years ago, or the United States at the beginning of the century, you may see one generation deviating from this, but all the rest is
yeah, really nice. Thanks for the presentation. Could you go back to the slide on the number of pairs? Because it's a bit related to that. So it's mostly a clarification question.
This one?
No, the one that's like 1 to up to more than 7, like the number of pairs.
Yeah. This is like raw, unconditional.
Just want to know like how it works in the end. So let's say that we are married and then I die. So who's the heir? Like you, my wife, husband, whoever, or a kid.
Okay. So
and then also people you probably have that died. They probably have like large, not large families, but not single kid families. So where does that one heir come from?
Okay. So first, it's not the inheritance tax law, but the inheritance law says that a deceased person can divide 50% of the estates according to her or his will, and the other 50% follow compulsory shares. And amongst the compulsory shares, 50% have to go to the spouse, and the rest has to be distributed among the children. So these are, for instance, cases where there is a surviving spouse and 6 children. It could also be cases where there is a surviving spouse, 2 children, and 4 other random people. And this one number of hair comes from a range of factors. For instance, I briefly mentioned that some heirs refuse to accept the inheritance. So if you have, for instance, a surviving spouse and the child refuses, because then the child, for instance, expects to get the rest from the surviving spouse at the later point. So it's like really a mix of.
One with tiny note. Have you analyzed something regarding gender? Because I guess you can see who.
We have, but I didn't put it here because we don't find strong gender gaps, but I think that this is driven by the higher life expectancy of women. So once women are in this data, they already have inherited from their spouses. So they have, yeah. So, yeah.
Thank you. I was wondering kind of about the inequality measure estimation. How sensitive is it to, like, I can't remember exactly the sample fraction of the entire population. I was wondering whether, like, the top 1% here is, of course, let's assume that it's almost randomly sampled, so it's supposed to be kind of okay, but still, if the sample is low, you might be essentially underestimating inequality, right?
So,
If you're just looking at the Gini, say, or the top shell.
but we have the oversampling, and of course we use weights. Sorry, this is like, we have the oversampling and we then use the weights to correct for the oversampling, so the differential sampling weights. The top one here, of course, it's like about 60 observations, probably.
Population, what's the population in Vienna?
The living population is 2 million. So overall, we have 14% of the deceased. And we have, it's not more than 70 observations for the top 1%. And then if we use the weight, it goes up to a bit more than 100.
Yeah, so I think at some point you were showing some descriptives. You said that the sample without the negative wealth was very close to the actual wealthy in Vienna, something like that. I don't know anything about how the wealth distribution is in Vienna. So I don't know how your estimates compare to the actual thing. So I guess what I'm wondering is, what are we learning from the dead that we cannot learn from the living? What are we learning from the dead that we cannot learn from the living?
So, what we learn, that's a very good question. So I think it's interesting because the distribution of wealth at death, it's sort of net of any. So, okay, no, it's not as easy. At the moment, we are mixing people who die expectedly and who die unexpectedly. And what we're working towards is to identify people who die unexpectedly, because I think this is a super relevant group, because it's like not an optimizing group in that sense. I think it's interesting here, especially because there is no inheritance taxation. So there are like no tax evadance or avoidance incentives driving accumulation or decumulation of wealth towards or after retirement. And I think it's also interesting because this distribution, so this specific population of people dying, it's the population that are then used sort of, that is relevant to a lot of other debates in terms of the mortality multiplier, in terms of intergenerational wealth transmission, and so on and so forth. And wealth transmission or inheritances and gifts, it's something that we don't have usually other good data sets on, because in surveys, it's like, we tend to say that about 20% of the aggregates are kind of captured, and this would be a bit better here.
On the question of the high portion of the real estate, I was wondering, because you mentioned that this is a uniquely Viennese phenomenon, probably. I'm just assuming that people who die in Vienna are not necessarily Viennese, so there's going to be a lot of in and out migration. So I was wondering if you are able to decompose that into people who've lived for a certain time already in Vienna and might have bought and thus accumulated more than others, or you know where the real estate that you actually capture here is kept, and if that's really all Viennese real estate. But, yeah.
So this is, okay, there are a couple of relevant aspects to this question. So the one is, the process is conducted within Vienna only if the sort of usual residence doesn't have to be tax resident or place of work, but the usual place, the middle of life, was the city of Vienna in the years pre-death. Otherwise, the Austrian, the courts say that they are not in charge, so it wouldn't be part of this. I have to say, here, it never, I mean, our sample is like super heterogeneous in terms of citizenship and so on and so forth. And it never occurred to me that we would have a lot of people who have been in Vienna just for a couple of years, because I think many of those, if it's for instance a student who moves to Vienna and then dies, I don't think that this person would be part of the sample by definition. But yes, I think we could.
I'm just thinking if
Yeah,
you
yeah.
Tirol or something, and then you move for your last job or for your retirement.
No, but Austrians don't move within the country. No.
South Tirol, then you're
Sorry.
Italian, and then you move or something like that.
Like, no, this is really not, no. Mm-mm. So within country migration, super low.
Okay, then across countries, fine.
Yeah.
I don't have a question, but I have a question to everybody. So you describe this data as highly confidential. You cannot take the papers away from a room, or you cannot show the names. In France, it's more or less the same. It's the same. We have access to the data, but we don't have access to showing less than X% of
Yes.
aggregate.
Yes.
But you know, in the UK, it's not like that.
Yes.
You can purchase
Yes.
all the individual data.
Yes.
Why do you think is the difference? Why I can see the will of Lady Diana Spencer and buy it, £20, and here is so restricted? I don't know. What are the...
Because the Tories have privatized everything, and so it's just.
It has always been like that. The choice has always been there, but what's the rationale of this restriction on one side and this total disclosure of information on the other side? Any more? Yeah.
Two very quick ones, but feel free to only take one.
The last.
The first is on your house prices. You had the
Yes.
unit value and the market value. You said it was kind of set in the 80s.
Yes.
What happens for all new properties that are built since the 80s?
So this has, so the values have been set, and they are tied to the location of the property, irrespective of when the property was built. So the values were set in the 80s, and since then there were like regular increases by an X-fold, let's say, and this value is applied to new property as well.
So it's just based on the area, not on property characteristics.
It is, so in our estimation, we account for property characteristics, but no, the values are by square meter or something like that.
Can we close? Thank you, Franziska, for the presentation, and thank you, everybody. See you next Tuesday. Next Tuesday, you have the next Tuesday.